Hello, I'm Susan Schneider, the William H. Enfield Professor at the University of Arkansas School of Law and the Director of the LLM program in Agricultural and Food Law. Our topic today is the Farm Bill, the major environmental law you've never heard of. The Farm Bill is an omnibus, multi-year law that governs an array of agricultural and food programs. Enacted approximately every 5 years, it essentially sets farm policy. It's one of the last remnants of bipartisan agreement, with that agreement only reached because of the careful balancing of interests between the farm and nutrition communities. Its impacts are diverse and significant. Our current Farm Bill was enacted in 2018, and negotiations are already underway for its replacement in 2023. Today, we're going to explore the Farm Bill and environmental law with two very distinguished environmental law attorneys. Peter Lehner is a managing attorney at EarthXjustice, directing the Sustainable Food and Farming Program. And Michael Drysdale is of counsel with the law firm of Dorsey and Whitney, where he has practiced environmental law for over 25 years. Peter and Mike, could you each tell us a little bit about your environmental law and agriculture experience? Peter, let's begin with you.
Sure. I started off working for the city of New York, where we have a water supply that is upstate. And one of the challenges was keeping that enormous surface water supply clean. And I found that the environmental laws gave me a great tool, me in the city of New York, a powerful tool to prevent pollution from most human sources into our drinking water. But it was a real challenge to address the waste from, for example, a number of the dairies and other agricultural operations. I later worked and ran the Environmental Bureau for the New York State Attorney General's office, and I saw the same thing statewide, that the environmental laws provide a really strong tool for addressing pollution from, for example, sewage treatment plants or industrial sources, but a much less powerful tool for addressing agricultural pollution. And later, when I was running NRDC, a National Environmental Group, we saw the same thing nationally. So each time I saw the mismatch between the pollution caused by much of industrial agriculture and the challenges that environmental law faces in addressing that pollution. The key to all of this is the Farm Bill. The Farm Bill is the one bill that addresses agriculture in both its positive and its negative aspects. And that's why I turned to start focusing on that.
Mike, can you share with us your environmental and agricultural law experience?
Sure. I've sort of been on the other side of the table. I've worked with agricultural industry clients my whole career. These can run the range from pretty small family operations to quite large crop processors. And across that range, there's a great deal of variation in how much their operations are constrained and regulated by the traditional environmental laws. But nearly all of them have a very large stake in the Farm Bill, and indeed often structure their entire businesses around what the Farm Bill supports, subsidizes, disincentivizes, et cetera. So it really is a major gravitational force in their entire industry.
Thank you, and thank you both for being with us. Before we jump into unpacking the Farm Bill and its impact on environmental law, we really need to explore the environmental impact of agriculture here in the United States. Peter, can you provide some explanation?
Sure. I think it's important first to recognize that agriculture in the US is actually quite good at doing what it is largely designed to do. Designed, as Mike said, by the Farm Bill, which is to say it produces tremendous quantities of food, fiber, and even fuel, biocorn for ethanol. Food is now cheaper than it's been in decades. We export a lot of food. And so it has been successful. It's doing exactly what it meant to do. However, that production has consequences. It uses a vast amount of land. There's about 800 million acres used for grazing, 400 million acres used for crops, only about half of which are actually eaten by humans. The others are used for animal feed. That's about 62% of the contiguous US is used for agriculture. It also uses about 80% of our water, as you can probably imagine. And on the other side, it actually is a major pollution source. As I mentioned earlier, the Clean Water Act, for example, has done a great job cleaning up industrial sources of pollution, but much less so from agricultural water pollution. So agriculture now is one of the dominant sources of water pollution. Runoff from fields and animal operations, especially excess fertilizer and pesticides and manure, soil erosion. You've probably heard of the dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico, eutrophication in Chesapeake Bay, or drinking water contamination, algae blooms. All of these water pollution problems are significantly contributed to by agricultural runoff. There's also, in another way, you probably don't think of agriculture as a major source of air pollution, but actually that's also true. There are some toxic gases such as hydrogen sulfide and ammonia that come from animal operations, smog producing nitrogen oxides from fertilizers, fine dusts, contaminating often local communities. And much of this often will carry the pathogens, the disease causing organisms, or even antibiotics from farms. Also, of course, all the truck emissions. So it's a major source of air pollution. And then because it uses all that land, it has changed a tremendous amount of habitat. It's a dominant reason why natural habitats, which says maybe wetlands or a forest or native grasslands, have been converted into agricultural land, which causes tension with wild species, whether it be wolves or bears, where ranchers want to be, or aquatic creatures, whether it be salamanders or mussels. And all of these driving from this enormous amount of land and water that agriculture uses. And finally, it's a major user of water, as I said earlier, which in some places, I'm in the fairly rainy Northeast where that's less of an issue, but in dry California, the use of water by agriculture puts a real stress on, for example, municipal water supply needs. And in the Midwest, agriculture is often draining some of the important aquifers. So we've got agriculture that on the one hand produces a tremendous amount of food very cheaply, and on the other hand has these environmental consequences that haven't fully been addressed. Unfortunately, many of these impacts particularly affect communities of color. For example, pesticides obviously affect farm workers, 2/3 of whom are people of color. And in North Carolina, another example, which is one of the top pork producing states, almost all of the major swine facilities are located in communities of color.
And I would just add to that, that among those enormous numbers that Peter was just referring to, you have a tremendous diversity of practices and companies, everything from very small operations to quite large operations, all of which have very disparate impacts. And also within that range of operations, you also have a tremendous degree of sophistication and technical resources in terms of people's ability to be sensitive and to be responsive to the environmental issues that may be causing. I don't know of anybody in the industry who's looking to cause environmental impacts, but these are operations that are often functioning on razor-thin margins, and their dominant objective is to produce food that they can then earn a living from. And if there are environmental consequences associated with that are allowed, either because they're not regulated or they are expressly permitted, that's going to happen to a certain degree. So, this isn't a situation of, bad actors or evil intent or anything like that. It's simply consequences of the system we have set up.
We also need to raise the issue of climate change. How does agriculture and our food system contribute to climate change? And what risks are there for our food system in a changing climate? Peter?
Well, let me address the risks first, which is, I think, something that every farmer or rancher is seeing more now. Climate is changing, and whether it be more floods and more droughts, more extreme storms, increased range of pests and heat waves, which are terrifically damaging to both animals and, of course, workers, wildfires. all of these probably affect agriculture more than almost any other form of sector of our economy, because agriculture is so dependent on the weather. And it's not just extreme events, it's regular patterns. Agriculture really depends on regular patterns, which are changing. In terms of agriculture's contribution to climate change, it's tricky because most people think about climate change as caused by the burning of fossil fuels, which releases carbon dioxide. And agriculture's primary contribution to climate change is really not so much carbon dioxide, although there is some carbon dioxide from all the farm equipment and energy used on farms. One of the main ways agriculture contributes to climate change is through emissions of methane. Methane come from emissions from manure and from cattle themselves, that every time they breathe out, they breathe a significant amount of methane. So the cattle industry, the agricultural industry, produces about as much methane in the US as the oil and gas industry. But we rarely think of that. And methane, as you probably know, is a potent greenhouse gas. Over 20 years, it's more than 80 times more powerful a greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. The other major way that agriculture contributes to climate change is through emissions of nitrous oxide, another greenhouse gas that's about 300 times more potent than carbon dioxide. And that largely comes from excess fertilizers. American farmers, for a variety of reasons, tend to put more fertilizer on their plants than the plants can actually take up. Some of that fertilizer runs off, as I mentioned earlier, and creates nutrient pollution. But other of it is converted by bacterial mechanisms into nitrous oxide, which, as I said, is a potent greenhouse gas. And finally, the last contribution of agriculture to climate change is through the conversion of land itself. Healthy lands, forests or grasslands, for example, have a tremendous amount of carbon in the soil. When that land is converted into agriculture and plowed every year and tilled every year, all of that carbon, or much of that carbon, is lost to the atmosphere, mixes with oxygen in the atmosphere and is lost as carbon dioxide. So the soils are depleted and less fertile, and it's lost a lot of carbon dioxide. So those are the 3 or 4 main ways that agriculture contributes to climate change.
Yeah, and the other thing that's important about the climate change impact of agriculture is how recent and rapidly evolving our understanding of these impacts are. I mean, most of the environmental laws that we'll be talking about a little bit later date from the 1970s, when climate change wasn't really on the radar at all. And even as recently as a couple of farm bills ago, there wasn't the kind of understanding of the impacts of agriculture on the climate that we have today. But year by year, we learn more about the interaction of soils and carbon, the carbon cycle, how different practices may increase emissions or reduce them or modify them. And so not only do we have a sector that has a large impact, but it's sort of the least understood in many ways of the big sectors. We've kind of known about the power industry's impacts for quite some time, and those are pretty straightforward. Same for the transportation sector. But agriculture sector is again, very diverse with very diverse impacts, and only recently and understood and with a very growing understanding. So that's another very important component to this whole issue.
Right, and I would just add, to be fair, it's also tougher to measure. It's not we may have a couple hundred power plants and you can know exactly what's going on in the power plant and figure out the carbon dioxide emissions. It's pretty hard to both model and measure what's coming off of hundreds of millions of acres of land. And for example, I mentioned nitrous oxide. The amount of nitrous oxide can depend on a lot of factors, whether it rains shortly after fertilizer application, how close, the time of year, the crop, the region. So our understanding, as Mike said, is changing, and biological systems are frankly more complicated than burning a hunk of rock, like coal.
This paints a dark picture for us. What structural issues are there that have allowed these problems to develop to this extent? Mike, could you explain a little bit about the structure of agriculture today and why it's hard to regulate for these types of environmental problems?
Sure. I think there's a few factors at play here. One is, as we mentioned before, the sector is extremely diverse. There are a tremendous number of and type of different operations that have tremendous variability in the types of impacts that they have. That means you can't adopt one size fits all solutions, at least not as much as you can for some other sectors. Another thing that's very important is, while there still is a tremendous amount of diversity and there are many very small operations, in the past couple of decades in particular, the industry has gotten much more concentrated. A much higher percentage of agricultural products are produced by very large operations and a very small number of operations. And that tends to make the impacts and the emissions more concentrated and more impactful than when we think back to our older vision of agriculture as just a bunch of tiny farms scattered across the landscape. So, and then finally, on certain issues like climate change, agriculture and agriculture's impacts have simply not been a regulatory or technological priority up until very recently. As we were just talking about, the impacts of the sector have only recently been understood, and that understanding is changing pretty rapidly. And in that context, it makes sense that it has not been much of a focus of our regulators and our technological innovators on how to deal with it. So all these things contribute to make it a uniquely difficult area to regulate.
I want to emphasize, though, that at the same time that what makes it difficult, what Mike just said, also provides a bit of hope, which is that even though there are a couple million farmers in the US, and even though maybe half of those are really not commercial farmers there for tax or lifestyle or other benefits, that's still a lot of farmers. It's a relatively small number of farmers, though, that cause, or farm operations, I should say, that cause the bulk of the pollution, that produce most of the product and produce most of the pollution. And that smaller number actually, I think, provides us a ray of hope. You don't have to work with hundreds of thousands or millions of operators. There's a much smaller number. For example, the top 10% of dairies produce 70% of the milk product. Those will be the ones you want to work with, not the other 90%. And from a number of different perspectives.
One other thing I would add to that too, that I think it's important to consider, is that while many of these are very large operations, many of the people who are the owners and operators are one or at most two generations removed from being the person on a small family farm. And so they come from a perspective where they don't often see the impacts that they have, or are accustomed to the kind of regulations that other industries are. And that very much affects their willingness to engage in more environmentally sustainable practices, their receptiveness to new regulation, and their perception of their role in the overall environmental context.
Well, what kind of agricultural practices or systems could we incorporate to resolve some of those problems and to lessen the carbon footprint of agriculture and better protect our food system? Peter, do you have some good news for us on that?
I do. And the good news is really due to the work of many farmers around the country who have used sometimes relatively old approaches and then modernized them, but have refined a whole suite of what are sometimes known as agroecological practices that have a tremendous number of benefits. They often dramatically reduce water pollution. They increase the carbon stored in the soil that I mentioned earlier can be released by agricultural operations. They can reduce the greenhouse gas emissions. They often reduce the need for chemicals and pesticides, and thus significantly reducing costs. And they can also build resilience to climate change, resilience to the floods and droughts and heat waves. So these are great practices. They're things that you may have heard of: cover crops, making sure the ground isn't bare in the winter; rotating crops so that nature's diversity can build strength; not tilling the ground as much; adding trees to cropland or to grazing land, trees that have much bigger roots, or other perennial crops; making sure you're rotating your cattle grazing rather than leaving them out there for a long time. All of these are well known at this point. They've been developed in many parts of the country, very often proven to be both terrific from an environmental perspective, but also much more profitable for the producer. Our challenge is that they're only used on a small portion of US land, maybe 2 or 3% or a little more for some practices. So our goal should be to dramatically accelerate the adoption of these practices that have proven to be so effective.
Yeah, and it's important also in terms of why many of these very creative practices are employed on such a small number of farms, is you have some really big obstacles to widespread implementation. And I would point to scaling, tailoring, and financing. From a scaling perspective, it's how do we take something that's been demonstrated to be effective on a particular farm or particular pilot study or particular set of conditions, and then scale that up to an industry that has very diverse practices around the country. Secondly, this question of tailoring, that where these innovative strategies are most effective is when they are very carefully structured and tailored to the particular operation. What does the contour of the land look like? Where does the drainage look like? What is the character of the soils? What are the particular crops and rotation of crops or other practices that are occurring? Having all that information together and factored into the design of a remedial measure is really important to making it work, but that requires a really deep understanding and consideration of the particulars of any specific farm. And then finally, financing. As I mentioned before, most agricultural operations, even some very large ones, operate on very small margins, and they are always vulnerable to the next bad crop cycle, the next downturn in the market, the next change in availability of credit, et cetera. And when push comes to shove, these operations are going to do what they need to do to survive. And if that means that they're going to plant some more on marginal land, or they're going to apply fertilizers a little bit more aggressively than might be called for environmental protection, they're going to do it if they're allowed to do it, and there's no way to make it economical for them to employ some more robust practices. So putting those three things together in a package that can then be used in a widespread way is a real, it's an opportunity, but it's a real difficult challenge.
Well, as we work our way toward the Farm Bill and farm policy specifically, I think it's important to consider what major U.S. environmental laws we have and how these either apply to agriculture or don't apply to agriculture. Mike, could you start us off on this?
Sure. Now, we don't really lack for environmental laws in this country, mostly stemming from the great burst of legislative activity that occurred in the 1970s. We have a wide array of environmental laws that cover a wide array of emissions, and in many ways could cover most of the impacts of all agriculture. I'm going to throw up a slide here that sort of lists 8 major environmental statutes. And as you can see from these, they go from sort of the traditional big hitters that we think of, like the Clean Water Act and the Clean Air Act, to more sophisticated and tailored substance-based laws like the Pesticide Acts and the Toxic Substances Acts. And if you add these all together, you really touch upon just about everything that agriculture could do. But as it turns out, by both design and practice, agriculture gets off pretty lightly under these laws. First of all, from a design perspective, most of these statutes focus on what we call in the lingo point sources, pipes and stacks, define things through which pollutants come out of. And when these laws were passed, that was where most of the environmental pollution was coming from, and most of the cleanup action could occur from. But as it turns out, most agricultural emissions don't come from pipes and stacks. They come from runoff from fields and very diverse and diffuse emissions from a whole variety of places that aren't pipes, aren't emission sources in that sense. In other cases, the law would seem to apply to certain emissions, but have been interpreted by court decisions more narrowly. For example, combined or concentrated animal feeding units are a major source of emissions throughout the country, and many of their emissions do come what would appear to be from pipes. But as the laws have been interpreted in many cases, they have been exempted. And so in that case, even though it would appear that the law covers a particular emission, in practical reality and through judicial interpretation, it does not, or does not as much as it could have. And finally, even where there is pretty clear statutory authority, oftentimes agriculture has gotten off lightly just as a practical and political matter. Both the Clean Water Act and the Clean Air Act have provisions that allow for the regulation of more diffuse non-point sources, but they're largely left to the states. And in general, agriculture has been lower profile in the targets for that kind of regulatory activity. That's for a variety of reasons. It's hard to do. The agricultural sector is well motivated and politically powerful in most states. And so states have generally found it to their advantage to focus on other areas in lieu of agriculture. You add all these things up together, and even though we have an awful lot of regulatory authority to theoretically control agricultural emissions, in practice, it's not as great as one might imagine.
I would simply add that one of the key factors of all of these environmental laws is some amount of transparency. An industrial source needs to have a permit and measure its emissions, and all of that is public. If you're not in the system, as most agriculture is not in the system, there's much less monitoring of the impacts, and whatever monitoring there is probably not publicly available. And so even though we know through EPA and other studies that as nationwide agriculture is having these tremendous environmental impacts, it's much tougher to get that down to a specific source, a specific water body, and get the type of evidence that, for example, I needed when I worked at the New York Attorney General's office to enforce our pollution laws. So that secrecy, or that lack of transparency, may be better, puts a real barrier into addressing agricultural pollution through our environmental laws, as Mike pointed out.
So clearly, we've got environmental problems associated with agricultural production. We've got an array of laws that, for one reason or another, are not applicable to the ag industry, or are not being implemented in that way. And we've got transparency issues in terms of what's going on. What about the Farm Bill? How does the Farm Bill influence farming practices, and what impact does this have, or can this have, on environmental issues?
So, the Farm Bill, in many ways, sets the agenda for farming over the next 5-year cycle. And while it has a number of titles and does quite a wide variety of things, I think it can be summarized as really three major, as it relates to the environment, three major activities. First, what the Farm Bill does is promote and support demand for agricultural products. That's through a variety of things like food nutrition, food stamps, other things of this nature that try to get food on the table for Americans. And while that doesn't directly relate to environmental protection, it defines how we eat in a large measure, how a large percentage of this country eats. And what the Farm Bill, in doing so, does or does not do is define then what the emissions are going to be from that style of eating. To the extent the Farm Bill promotes the American diet, that means it's going to be promoting a diet that's rich in protein, that has a lot of animal products, and then has the emissions associated with animal products. A second thing that the Farm Bill does is promote and support the supply of agricultural products. The two big ways it does through that are things like crop insurance and price support programs. And what those do is those help farmers reliably and consistently get food to the market. That can be through protecting them through the adverse effects of weather and market cycles. It can be through giving a better price for their products so that production is higher than it would otherwise be. And then, of course, the crops that are supported, and there's really about 14 crops that are considered commodity crops that get the lion's share of the support, those are the ones that we're going to produce, and those are the ones that we're going to see impacts from. And the final and really important part of the Farm Bill that directly relates to environmental protection is the conservation programs. Peter will talk a little bit more about those. but there's a variety of programs that are expressly designed to reduce the environmental impact of the agricultural sector. Now, I'll throw up another slide here that sort of shows the relative balance of these three things. And what you can see here is that over this 9-year cycle of the last 9 years or so of expenditures, or goes into 2023, that about 80% of all the money spent in the Farm Bill goes to that's the demand side expenditure, the nutrition type programs that define what we eat and therefore what we produce. The next big chunk is, which is quite a bit less, is the programs designed to support supply, the crop insurance and commodity programs. And then finally, smallest of all, are the conservation programs. That doesn't mean that the environmental effect and bang for the buck of each of these programs is exactly dollar for dollar equal, but it shows you the relative importance of these things. And altogether, these three things, by defining what we're eating, what we're producing, and related to what the effects are, all in a way that's as important as any direct environmental law, influences the impact of the sector. Peter, you want to add something on the conservation programs and other points?
Sure, and actually I'll go back a bit and say it's helpful to remember that the Farm Bill really started during the Depression after the Dust Bowl. And so there were two major goals. One was to address the environmental consequences of the Dust Bowl, and the other was to deal with the Depression, which had two parts. One was people were hungry and needed to be fed, and the other was that the prices that farmers were receiving for their crops was very, very low. So the early Farm Bill had some programs where they would limit the supply of food to keep the price high by either the government buying that food and providing it to the poor, or by just making sure farmers didn't plant. Those programs that originally stuck together a little bit now are separate programs, but politically they're still very necessary in order to get the Farm Bill, because very different constituencies tend to focus on the feeding programs, the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, and the farm program. And in order to get this through, and it has to get through every 5 years, you need this broad constituency. I think it's helpful to look at some of these programs in a little more detail, like as Mike mentioned, the commodity programs, which farmers get paid just based on historical plantings. It's not crop insurance. They don't have to pay a premium for about 14 or 15 commodity crops. And they get paid if the price drops a certain amount or if the yields drop a certain amount. And because it's based on historical plantings, of course, it essentially creates a bit of a break on changing what you do. What a farmer is going to plant something new. And because it's based on historical plantings, also, you want to have a lot of historical plantings, which has been encouraging, as Mike said, planting perhaps on marginal lands. That program gives out about $6.5 billion every year. Crop insurance is similar, but farmers have to pay the premium like in insurance, although actually the taxpayer subsidizes about 2/3 of that premium. And right now that's about $7.5 billion every year. This covers, unlike commodity, which covers only 14 or 15 crops, this covers about 130 crops, but still 80% of the payments go to corn and soybean. So it covers other crops, but still the vast majority goes to these major commodity crops. And now let's turn to the conservation programs, because all of them have, you will see, some history. One is and perhaps the best known, is the Conservation Reserve Program, which pays farmers, usually in 10-year contracts, to take land out of production. That program is about $2 billion a year. And of course, when the land is out of production, it has it doesn't produce as much water pollution or air pollution and provides some habitat. So on the one hand, that's great. On the other hand, sometimes they don't pay farmers enough, so doesn't make sense for them to take the land out of production. Sometimes the land is not the most ecologically valuable land. And perhaps most importantly, very often after the 10-year contract is up, the land goes back into production. So if you, for example, have stored more soil in the carbon during that 10-year period, it can be lost when the land is put back into production. Another of the major conservation programs is called the Conservation Stewardship Program. This gets about $1 billion a year. And this is more for practices where usually 5-year contracts, the government will assist, pay a portion of a shift to better, more ecologically sound practices. And this is generally gets favorable reviews, although not all the practices supported, as we know more, are necessarily that good for the environment. Another of the major conservation programs is called EQIP, the Environmental Quality Improvement Program. And this is for capital projects, really, for infrastructure, where the government will pay a significant portion, usually 70% or more, of costs of infrastructure upgrades. And those, it sounds good, but actually the Natural Resource Conservation Service, which implements the program, has itself found that many of the programs that EQIP supports actually are not really beneficial for the environment, and yet they're still significantly supported. So there's a tremendous opportunity to take this good idea and tailor it much better. And finally, there's a couple programs that will pay really for permanent easements, agricultural conservation easements. That only gets about $500 million a year. And that will essentially buy the agricultural rights so that the land is put longer term or permanently into perhaps more ecologically beneficial purposes. I think it is important in all of this to note that that is very often the environmental community has focused almost entirely in the Farm Bill debates on the conservation programs. And I think that's something that we hope this program will alert more people to the importance of all the programs, because all the programs have a real impact on what happens in the environment. And so all the programs are important. I should mention just quickly at the end that Farm Bill, as Mike mentioned at the beginning, has a whole series of other titles, including trade promotion. Much of our food is exported to other countries, and the US does a lot to promote trade so we can export grain, feed grains, and meats. There are provisions dealing with credit. Farmers need both long-term and short-term credit. Every year you need some working capital to plant, and you may need longer-term credit in order to be able to expand or build a new operation. There's research titles. There's titles dealing with rural energy. There's titles dealing with bioenergy, organic agriculture, and horticulture. So there's a lot in this bill. The last bill was over 800 pages long. An additional problem with all these programs, both the supply and the conservation programs, is that they were implemented for decades in a highly discriminatory fashion. This has led to a terrible loss of farmland by Black and Indigenous farmers and other farmers of color. And moreover, when we think about all of these programs as providing a farm safety net, there's virtually no part of the Farm Bill that provides a safety net to farm workers, again, who are mostly people of color and who do most of the work on our farms.
As we look forward to the next Farm Bill, and as I mentioned in the introduction, we're already beginning some negotiation on that. Are there some of the provisions that come out to you that we should be looking at for additional environmental protections and an additional environmental impact?
Sure, I'll offer a couple quick thoughts. As Mike mentioned earlier, one of the challenges to scale up these agroecological, more sustainable practices is we don't know that much about them. They've been used successfully, but only in some areas. Agricultural research has been starved in the last couple decades. It is now less than half of what it used to be. The US used to be a leader in agricultural research, and now we are not. And private agricultural research does not take the place of public agricultural research. It looks into different things. So, and even when there was agricultural research, very little of it went into issues relating to sustainability or climate change. It largely went into productivity. So there's a great opportunity to significantly increase the research into sustainable agriculture practices. So we just frankly know much more about them and have a much bigger arsenal. Another opportunity is in the outreach programs. I mentioned these conservation programs. All of those are to some extent accompanied by outreach. The Natural Resource Conservation Service has thousands of employees in virtually every county in the country, and they can provide much more technical assistance, outreach, and education on these more sustainable practices. And as Mike said earlier, the second challenge to scaling up is tailoring. What works in Georgia will not work in New York, will not work in Illinois or Washington. And so it's really important that we have this extraordinary opportunity of technical specialists in every county. That's very regional, that's very specific, who can help farmers figure out what are the cover crops that work for my soil in my region. And that is an opportunity just with the existing program to dramatically scale up. Mike,
Yeah.
You want to mention some others?
Yeah, and I would add that I wouldn't look away from some of the big ticket items as well too. So to give you a concrete example of kind of how a lot of this plays together, I do a lot of legal work for a sugar beet cooperative in northern Minnesota. Minnesota, believe it or not, produces a lot of sugar. And that entire operation is structured around the Farm Bill. Sugar is one of the commodity crops. It's a price-supported crop. And the entire facility and the entire array of farmers who are participants in that facility is defined around how much price-supported sugar they can produce. So that's, if that were adjusted in one fashion, up or down, that would affect how much sugar is produced and the impacts of that sugar. They've also been very reliant on crop insurance. They had a freeze a number of years ago that would have devastated the operation were it not available for crop insurance. And so were there terms and conditions associated with crop insurance provisions that were related to environmental practices that would have an influence on their behavior. They've also done some really creative things with the state in terms of management of their wastewater, but that was through a state initiative. Similar kinds of initiatives could be done at the federal level, again, as part of the basic commodity support structure that could promote creative things more widely. So while there's a lot of, Peter identified a number of really great technical research-based stuff that could be done, there's also room for innovation on the basic structure of the bill that could have some very positive impacts going forward.
Yeah, I want to really emphasize and agree with Mike on that. We mentioned earlier that commodity payments are based on historical plantings. Exactly how that is linked creates, as I mentioned, a barrier to innovation. That can be changed in a new farm bill. There's also an important provision called conservation compliance for any farmer that accepts money from the commodity programs, the crop insurance, or the conservation programs. They have to comply with a few conservation requirements. But in reality, those conservation and compliance requirements are very, very modest. They only apply to about a quarter of cropland and not really to grazing land. They don't require much in terms of sustainability, but they do represent a deal that is really quite fair. That if the producer is going to get a lot of support from the government, which is appropriate because we are concerned about having a farm safety net, but we want to make sure that that producer isn't producing in a way that is harming their neighbors, whether downstream or downwind, or their communities. And so there's a great opportunity, I think, to increase that conservation compliance program, increase its coverage, increase what is required, provide more outreach and support for oversight so it's implemented much better than it currently is. So there's the conservation programs that can be better targeted. There's conservation compliance that could be expanded and better targeted. These core commodity programs that have hidden in them formulas that create disincentives for better practices often, or incentives for practices that have impact. All of that can be adjusted in a new farm bill. And in a way, I think that would be actually beneficial not only to the environment and to people eating, but also to the producers themselves.
We're almost out of time now, but I'd like to give each one of you a chance to provide a final comment about the issues that we've discussed and where we should go from here. Peter, could you start us off?
Sure. But I'm first going to mention one thing that some of the folks who are actually now in USDA have suggested using the government's trade authority, what's called the Commodity Credit Corporation or something like that, essentially to pay farmers to implement climate-friendly practices. And it's another version of what I was saying earlier, perhaps a deal that if instead of just pay them to make sure their practices are more sustainable. I think there's great opportunity there. Takes a lot to change practices. We need our food, and we should be willing to pay to assist that transition. In terms of my last comment, I would just say, as we've tried to emphasize, the Farm Bill affects all of us. It's the food we eat, it's the land we live on, it's the water we drink. And too often, environmental interests and others really don't pay much attention to it. So we are hopeful through this program and through learning more about the Farm Bill, people will realize that the Farm Bill is really one of the most important environmental issues that they can get engaged with, and we will have a better result the more people that engage with it. As I noted, most of these US farm programs have been implemented for years in a highly discriminatory fashion. Fortunately, there's now a lot more attention to these issues and awareness of the need to address this. And it is going to be critical that all of these reforms we discuss are implemented in a way that benefit all farmers, and particularly those who've been historically excluded or disadvantaged by farm programs.
Yeah, and I would end on a fairly hopeful note as well. You know, it's the reality of our times that it's almost impossible to pass most legislation. And you know, as we saw, the major environmental laws date back from the 1970s. But the Farm Bill is an exception. It's a must-pass piece of legislation, and it will pass. No state can afford to not have its delegation work very hard to do the Farm Bill, and that gives a tremendous leverage to all entities, including environmental interests. So it's a rare and unique opportunity to employ some creative policy initiatives that both continue to put good, abundant food on the American table, and yet also lessen the impact of the sector, of the landscape and the climate. It's really one of our current most important policy laboratories. And I echo Peter's call that people should be engaged and be involved as the next Farm Bill is developed.
Thank you. What a fascinating discussion. Thank you to Michael Drysdale from Dorsey and Whitney. Thank you to Peter Lehner from Earth Justice. And thank you for joining us today to learn more about this very important topic.
Thank you.